Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we have a very special interview with one of the world's leading experts on Islam and the Middle East. Warm welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And today's special guest is Harold Rode, all the way from Florida in the United States. He served 3 decades in the US Department of Defense and is one of the world's leading experts on Islam and the Middle East. Harold, warm welcome.
Thank you. I've got a lot to learn, I must tell you, even at my age.
It's an absolute pleasure that you can join me on this Zoom edition of the Middle East Report. And I personally want to thank you because you've been an inspiration to me, especially as a 24-year-old graduate from the University of Manchester, who was kind of desperate to stand up and fight for Israel and the Jewish people. And you spent so much time with me. You allowed me to have a personal tour of the Pentagon, and I really value friendship. And this is one of the most special interviews that I've done during the whole 10 years that I've been doing the Middle East Report. So I want to thank you for doing this interview today.
Well, I hope I don't disappoint you, Simon. We all have a lot to be modest and humble about, and I try my best.
Thank you. And you're also the author of a book I've got here called Modern Islamic Warfare. But before we discuss this, can you share with us something about your background and your Jewish background growing up and living in Philadelphia?
Well, I think until about 5 years old, I didn't really know I was Jewish. We lived in a poor neighborhood in about 1955. An Israeli couple with their young daughter moved in across the street, and they awakened in me a Jewish, not religious, but a Jewish identity and a concern for the land of Israel, to which they returned when I was 9. That was 1959. I'm an old guy. And when I was bar mitzvah at age 13, I went to Israel with a group of young Jewish Americans, lived in a boarding school for the summer, and on weekends went to this family. And it awakened in me a very strong, deep commitment to the land of Israel. And I was very fascinated by the Muslims. And we're going to leave the Christians who speak Arabic today out of this for a moment, but I think it'd be very important to come back to it at one point. I wanted to find a way to make peace between the Muslims and the Jews. After all, my people, the Jewish people, had, its history is one which is not a, shall we say, particularly happy one. We Jews sometimes make jokes about things. They tried to kill us. Some of us survived. Now let's eat. The point of it being that it's very, very, very hard. Now, I knew in America at that time that all sorts of groups got along. After all, I was one of them. I lived in a largely Black neighborhood, and we all managed. And I knew that there had to be some way to make peace between the Muslims and the Jews. So at least there wouldn't be a problem. There wouldn't be a need for wars all the time. And so I dedicated my life. I decided already at the age of 13 and a half, 14, that I was going to study Islam. I was going to learn about the Muslims. I at least had enough sense at the time to understand that you need to understand others as they understand themselves, and to use their culture and how they say things to get to what you wanted. Now, I know we in America, we compromised. That's how we all got along. But I didn't yet realize that in Islam, there is no such thing as compromise. But I was young. And I graduated high school in Philadelphia, and got a MA, PhD, and studied all over the Muslim world with one goal. How do we make this work? How do we get along? How do we get peace as I understood it? I studied in Iran during the revolution, for example. I studied in Egypt before the 1973 Yom Kippur October War. One goal, I wanted to understand these people. I learned their languages, I learned their cultures. And what I unfortunately learned, and it pains me to say this, is that they don't have a sense of compromise as we do. They have what the late great and grew up in Britain, my mentor, Professor Bernard Lewis, who was like a father to me. He used to summarize it this way: I'm right, you're wrong, go to hell. And that's not the way I was brought up. And I did my damnedest in my 20s, putting off getting my PhD, running around the Muslim world. I once could pray better as a Muslim than as a Jew. That's how deeply I got into the Islamic culture to try to find the way. I would sit in the tea houses and look, in restaurants, and I would discuss the Quran, which I knew better than the Bible at that time. I would be able to quote with them back and forth, and it always bothered me that I was failing. After all, you've got to find a way. That's what the American way. That's how we did it. And it wasn't working. And then, when I was in my mid 20s, I read an article by, again, Professor Bernard Lewis, the greatest Middle Eastern historian of the latter part of the 20th century and the earlier part of the 21st century. I read an article in Commentary magazine called The Return of Islam. And his message was quite simple. Personally, to me, Harold, there's nothing wrong with your abilities. Your problem is you're trying to see the Muslim world in your terms, in our terms in the West. We in the West were leaving religion and going towards nationalism. And nationalism was everything. And what Bernard Lewis's article said was no, that's not how the Middle East was working. You must understand the Islamic mentality as they do. And your problem isn't your abilities. Your problem is your framework that you're using. Once I don't read well, never have. I have ADD. And so I read that article 3 times, and it was a revelation to me that if you use their framework and how they see the world, you, I became from a poor analyst, I must say. I got good grades all the time, but I never could figure out what was going on, why it was going on. And thank God for Professor Lewis. He made me, I think, into a pretty good analyst of the Middle East. And I've been, ever since the mid 70s, been using the Muslim way of understanding things, which I don't like, but it makes me understand how that how Israel can survive, how the West can survive, why God is so important, and how our understanding of God is the source of everything. The Muslims are so proud that they believe in God. We in the West, I invariably will tell people at the end of a conversation, God be with you. Americans are a little afraid of that. Every once in a while I'll get, and God be with you too. But most of the time there's a sort of a silence. And this is so dangerous because everything comes from God in the end. And the Muslims get this, and we don't. Their view of what God wants is very different from ours, from the Judeo-Christian tradition. But that's the basis of everything.
And Harold, can you share with us what it was like studying in Iran back in the spring and summer of 1978, just as the Islamic Revolution was kicking off? And did that change your perception of Iran and the Middle East? Because with the Islamic Revolution, we saw that the Middle East almost changed overnight, and we saw a massive resurgence in political Islam.
Yeah, it did. Here's why, first of all. that my fellow Iranian students were all Muslims basically, and they had a view of America and the Jews. And America was Christian. America was head of the Christian world. And they believed that the Jews ran the world, so we ran America, which it has absolutely nothing to do with the truth, but that's what they believe. And much as I would try to understand how they saw the world, I realized I couldn't get through to them to say, hey, we have a different perception. And this is, if you look at it from our point of view, then you will understand us better. But it just couldn't work. I used to ask people there how many Jews there are in the world to see if they'd understand. And their answer was they thought maybe 200-300 million Jews. Now, we are in the United States maybe about 6.5 million, if that. And in the whole world, maybe we're 14-15 million. There's no way they could believe that, because how could such a small people run the world? Now, believe me, I can tell you from my own experience in the American government, I know we didn't run the world. There's no question about it. And I know that little Israel, which is, I don't know how big Greater London is, but I would assume that all of Israel is not much bigger than let's say twice Greater London. But they couldn't believe something like that. And much as I did to try to explain to them what I knew was the truth, it didn't help. Let me give you an example. As Iran began to fall apart, and I saw demonstrations, I saw riots, I saw people being shot. It ends up the people who were having the guns, it wasn't the Iranian government, but I didn't understand what was going on. I would ask my fellow Iranian students the following question, a logical one, which I didn't realize was from the wrong question. In Shiite Islam, which is almost a different religion from Sunni Islam, that's how different they are. In Shiite Islam, every family has an ayatollah, a grand ayatollah, to whom it looks for guidance, to whom it it gives money or it gets alms if necessary. And since I know this and I read this, I was asking my fellow Iranian students, each like individually, and who was the grand ayatollah of your family? Now, I was studying in a city called Mashhad, which is an extremely religious city in northeastern Iran, away from Tehran, away from foreigners. Basically, there were very few foreigners in that city. And they all looked at me and smiled as if they didn't have a clue of what I was talking about. And after a few times, I said, this makes no sense, because I had read so much about them and how they think. And everything that I had read said that that's how they understood that they looked to these grand ayatollahs. And I knew the names of 6 grand ayatollahs at the time. And I would mention them. I also mentioned a guy named Khomeini, who was shortly going to be the leader of Iran, about whom I knew very little. And I went down the list of people, and they looked at me as Iranians can look you straight in the face and smile and lie, something that we in the United States certainly cannot do. If I'm lying to you, Simon, for example, you look away. There's some way you indicate it in your body language that you're not telling the whole truth. But in Iranian culture, you can look one straight in the eye and lie. What are you doing? You're not really lying. You're protecting yourself because you're afraid of what the other person could do to you. But I didn't get that yet. Okay, I mention these names and I get no response. This made no sense to me. As Iran began to fall apart and there were riots in the streets and all that, I'm out in the streets with some of my fellow students who are yelling, "Death to the Shah, long live Khomeini." I'm furious. Why am I furious? Remember, Khomeini was one of the names that I mentioned to them. So why are they yelling long live Khomeini? They're obviously for him. That means they must know something about him. I'm furious. I go back to the dormitories. Um, all of a sudden, there's a knock on my door. Harold, can, can we come in and talk with you? And I'm furious because they lied to me. I'm totally wrong, but didn't know it. They come in, they close the door, and Persian, colloquial Persian, is it's an Indo-European language. It's a little French. Qui est Khomeini? Who is Khomeini? In Persian, it's backwards, the same phrase. They asked me, Khomeini, qui est? Who is Khomeini? Who they been out on the streets yelling for? And I had no clue what's going on here. I realized I didn't understand. What had happened was follows. They said to me that when I asked them, did they know any of these Ayatollahs or who was there, and I mentioned them, they knew them all. But they were afraid that I, if they had told me anything, could possibly report to the police and they could get arrested, which is why they lied to me. They were protecting themselves. They weren't lying to me. Why did they come to me and ask Khomeini who was Khomeini? Because they remembered that when I listed these grand Ayatollahs, that I mentioned his name. They hadn't a clue who he was, but they saw power shifting from the Shah to Khomeini. And it is extremely important to be with the winner, because if not, when the winner takes over, he will go after you and he could kill you. And they thought I knew who Khomeini was, that they were yelling for, but they hadn't a clue who he was. And then I said to myself, Harold, I was 28 years old at the time. I said, Harold, I don't really understand anything. And I have to go back to the basics. And from then on, I dedicated my life really even more so. I realized their view matters if I'm to deal with them. It's the only way. Now, I must tell you, unfortunately, I went back to the United States, finished my PhD, and 3 years later, thank God, to work for the Pentagon, which the government experience was a fascinating one, many times very difficult.
Sorry, Hal, can I just take you a step back there? How did you get that opportunity, as you were a university lecturer in Islamic history, to then be given the opportunity then to be invited to work for the Pentagon, which would have been under President Ronald Reagan? So how did that happen?
Yes. Well, I was teaching part-time, going nowhere quickly. The academic establishment, even back then in the late 70s, was already in the hands of the anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-Western establishment. And my mentor was Bernard Lewis, whom they hated with a passion. And the fact that I was a supporter of his guaranteed that I couldn't get an academic appointment. Bernard Lewis was very close with a senator named Henry M. Jackson from Washington State, who was a liberal domestically, but internationally very strongly opposed to the Soviet Union. And he was one of the liberators of a concentration camp in the Second World War. And he, who was not Jewish, decided to dedicate his life to make sure that the Jewish people, like you, like good Christians, like evangelicals, say we must do whatever we can to really do what the Bible tells us. God says, I will love those, I will bless those who bless the Jewish people, and I will curse those that curse the Jewish people. That's already in Genesis.
Amen.
And Henry M. Jackson, Senator Jackson was that. And his aide was a guy by the name of Richard Pearl. Richard Pearl was working at the Pentagon at the time. And Bernard Lewis was very close with him and called Richard Pearl and said, I have a really outstanding Middle Eastern scholar, and you deal with Turkey, and his PhD is in Ottoman Turkish studies, and I think you should take him. And Richard Pearl, who became an older brother to me and still is. I owe him a huge amount. He's a wonderful human being. Richard Pearl hired me, and that's how I got my opportunity to implement what I learned basically on the ground in the Muslim world, more than in my academic studies. How I had got the opportunity for 28 years to on Turkey, on Iran, and the Arab world. And most of the time, it was a joy to have that opportunity. I'm so grateful that I had this opportunity to apply the knowledge that I had learned living in the Muslim world, living in many instances a Muslim life. I never became a Muslim, but living their life with them and to use that. And many senior people, mostly Republicans, but also Democrats, were very interested in knowing and having my knowledge, very senior people, because I had a different view than the bureaucratic view. And it was one based on knowledge and living with the people. And so that's how I got my opportunity. And I thank God, and I thank those who were, let's say, his servants, who, whether they were religious or not, maybe they didn't know it, but they were the ones who brought me into the Pentagon and gave me an enormous opportunity. I'm very grateful for that.
So you've literally for 28 years worked on the formation of US Middle Eastern foreign policy and also advising various US Secretary of Defense. Who was the best US Secretary of Defense that you ever worked with? Because also, sadly, we know that Donald Rumsfeld passed away recently as well.
Well, I was a huge fan, first of all, of First Secretary of Defense Cheney. And then when he became vice president, I worked with his staff and somewhat with Cheney himself, also on this. Asked superb questions about the Middle East. And he was also very close with Professor Bernard Lewis. It's always a small world. Donald Rumsfeld was also very good questions. There were other secretaries of defense that I had, shall we say, a little less respect for. There are two types of people who are in government. There are those who are there because they believe in the mission of America and they believe in advancing America's interest in the world. And they are awesome individuals. And then there are others who, let us say, they're more interested in power, in political careers. And I always saw power as a tool, one that you must have deep respect and awe and fear of. Because when you're working in the defense establishment or in the policy establishment, what you're saying and what you're doing can have very, very serious ramifications on others' lives. And we must keep that in mind at all times. There are, and I don't want to go into details because I don't think it's particularly useful. Let us just say it was Cheney and Rumsfeld that I had the most respect for of all the secretaries of defense that when I was at the Pentagon. And again, I spent a lot of time in other institutions, again, a lot at the White House as well.
And Harold, take us back to that fateful day on September the 9th, 2001, when the Pentagon was hit. How did that change your life, and how did that then wake up the Bush administration to this new kind of Islamist threat that emerged after 9/11?
That day, September 11th, I was happened to be in Cairo for work meetings. And it was funny, my wife was she did not want me to go to Cairo. It was dangerous at the time. And she was begging me not to go. And I went, I went because I was asked to go to these meetings. And the day the Pentagon was hit, and the cell phone system was in terrible shape at the time, I finally got through to my wife, and she's crying and saying, "Thank God you're there and not at the Pentagon." Um, uh, I the place what was hit was, frankly, the Pentagon is a five-sided building, but where my office was on the other side of where the plane hit, and the chances of me having been at a meeting on the other side at that time would have been very slim had I been there. But you never know. It's all in God's hands. Um, uh, it changed a lot. There were a lot more people who were interested who became interested in how could they do such a thing. But please understand the following: when um, anything in the concept of jihad, which we call holy war in English, I prefer to call it jihad is anything that can help advance the cause of Islam as the people see it. And for example, bin Laden and his people, the people who crashed into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon, they knew, and I'm using their way of looking at the world, not ours. They knew that the moment that they did that, first of all, they were advancing the cause of Islam as they saw it. And what happens to a martyr? The word is shahid. A martyr is, which is very poorly translated as a witness, but it is one who who dies in the cause of advancing Islam. And the moment he dies, he is surrounded by 72 perpetual virgins in paradise forever. Now, it doesn't matter what I think about that, nor you, Simon. That's how they saw it. They were advancing the cause of Islam. We in the West have armies fighting each other. They know that they can't match us, army versus army. So they use what we today call asymmetric warfare, which is they get us in ways which we find impossible. For example, Afghanistan. To quote again Professor Lewis, his argument always was, whenever we have to do anything in the Middle East, whenever you have to go after the people who are corrupt, go in, take care of the problem, and get out. Don't stay, because you will be bogged down and you will lose. Now, I want to go back to September 11th for a moment. Everything in the Middle East is symbolic. Why the date September 11th? And if you listen also to bin Laden's speech that he gave afterwards, which was filled with Islamic imagery, we were clueless on this, but someone who was versed in Islam got it right away. For example, he said in his speech after the bombings, after the crashing into the World Trade Center and whatever, he talked about what was done, passive voice, 80 years beforehand. What does it mean 80 years beforehand? For Americans, we say something that happened last week. That's history. In other words, it doesn't matter. Because Americans, unfortunately, especially in my generation, and I'm 71, that's when they began to take out the study of the founding fathers, which is the values on which the United States was founded, which are the values of Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments. The Creator was very, very important to the founding fathers. But they tried to weed that out of us. And what is 80 years ago? Well, here's the answer. 80 years ago, there was the end of World War I, when the Europeans, from the Muslim point of view, destroyed what was called the Caliphate. The rule by Islam must be ruled by a caliph. What is a caliph? It's the Khalifa in Arabic. It means one who came in place of their prophet Muhammad after he died. There's a whole series of people that's descended with. And the caliphate was abolished in the Ottoman Empire, which was the strongest Middle Eastern or the Muslim state in the world at that time. And we, according to bin Laden and company, we, the West, that would be Rome, the head of the Catholic Church, and the United States, we're the ones who ended the caliphate. That's not true, but that's what they said. That is number one, which when I was telling this, I remember to some of the senior people, in the American government, that they looked at me like I was nuts. And from an American point of view, they were right, and I was wrong. But that I was telling me the reality. And here's another symbolic thing. Why the choice of September 11th of all dates? Remember, the goal was to get at us. Why is September 11th important to us? Well, in the year 1683, the Ottoman Turks had advanced all the way through southern Europe, and they were at the gates of Vienna. And remember, their goal was to take over the Christian, the non-Muslim world. And in Islam, once a country or once a land becomes part of Islam, it's Islamic forever. We can't understand that. There's no way, once it's Muslim forever. A territory, and if a person converts to Islam, if he decides to leave, the penalty for that is death. The apostasy, and if you leave Islam, the penalty is death. Now, what happened? The Ottomans are winning, and they're at the gates of Vienna, which was the biggest in Eastern Europe, Eastern Central Europe at the time, Christian fortress. And the Polish Catholic forces come. And on September 11th, they get to Vienna and they help the Viennese, the Habsburgs, and they defeat the Ottomans. This is the beginning of the retreat of Islam, September 11th, 1683. And during the next centuries until the end of World War I, Islam withdraws and withdraws because it's weak and the Christians are winning. The Austrians invented the croissant, the bread that we eat. We think it's French, and it's in the form of a crescent. And the way you opened it, you held an end in one hand and you broke it apart. And that is why the croissant was invented, because that's what happened in Vienna. It was the beginning of the retreat of Islam. And that's why they chose September 11th to attack the World Trade Center, to attack America, the center of non-Muslim power. And this was to the Americans who were listening to me, they thought I was off the wall. I said, please understand, I don't advocate what I'm saying. I'm only trying to explain their mindset, because they make decisions based on their mindset, not ours. And that's the way it was.
That's fascinating. How really fascinating. I didn't know that. I'll certainly look at croissants now.
Look it up.
Different light now after what you've told me, and we've told our viewers as well.
Wait,
but
Simon, can I just say, please, you mentioned this little book on modern Islamic warfare, Ancient Doctrine Marches On, that I wrote. It's a short book, but the cover is a picture of the defeat of the Ottomans at Vienna in 1683. It is the beginning of the retreat of Islam, which they are trying to avenge now, because all that territory is theirs. That's how they see it.
Excellent. And Harold, if we talk about 9/11 as well, and the 9/11 Commission mentioned the fact that there was Iranian involvement. There have been a few books, but not many mentioned, of this alliance between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Al-Qaeda, and that this was a joint operative from the Iranian regime and also Al-Qaeda, and allowing the Iranians to use Al-Qaeda to attack the United States, but protecting their terror networks as well. Now, considering that you were in the Pentagon at the time when this happened and helped formulate policies on the war and terror, what is your understanding of Iran's involvement in 9/11?
Iran is Shiite. Bin Laden was Sunni. Wahhabi is a particular type of Sunni Islam. They hate each other. They are in internal battle. There's no such thing as compromise or peace. There is no concept of peace in Islam that we have in the West. Bygones be bygones. And we could not imagine that Shiites and Sunnis could cooperate. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. because now I'm going to try to put it in American terms. I said, are there instances, and remember this is when this is people who had all vivid memories of the American Soviet Union relationship. It's only 10 years or 11, 12 years after the end of the Soviet Union. I said, were there times that the CIA and the KGB cooperated on a mission when each of them saw it in their interest to do so, even though in the grand scheme of things, they were sworn enemies? And then I would invariably get from the smartest American government officials sort of a smile on the face. And I remember once saying, I never thought of it that way. Yes, the Shiites and Sunnis are at each other's throats, and they can't stop until the other one accepts their view. And they will use any means to get there. But that is why the Shiites and the Sunnis, why Iran, which is really, even to this day, since the Iranian Revolution, it's the center of international terror. And by the way, I want to tell you the Arabic word for terror, irhab, means it's not a bad thing. We think of it as bad, but it is a means of, let's again, as I mentioned before, asymmetrical warfare. What it means is this is one of the ways of defeating us, and you use anything you can to do so. So what we define as terrorism, which we loathe and we consider so bad, this is just a form of Islamic warfare. So how can it be bad? It's helping advance Islam. Now, you try to explain that to some of these radical extremist Muslims, that it's bad. They'll look at you like you're nuts. But our guys, when I try to explain it in our terms, this analogy that I just mentioned about the KGB and the CIA cooperating at times, it made sense to them. This is all that all my time that I spent at the Pentagon. This is all I tried to do. Tried to make our senior leaders see the mindset of the other side.
And Harold, you were very much involved in the planning of the Iraq War in 2003 and helped to bring about the downfall of Saddam Hussein. And you mentioned earlier from Bernard Lewis that the idea was to carry out your strategic objectives, bring about the fall of the regime, and then get out of there.
Yes.
Do you think some of the big mistakes that were made in the Iraq War and the aftermath of it was not looking at the Middle East in its context, by taking Iraq out of the context of the rest of the Middle East, by not actually looking at the domino effect that war would have on the rest of the region?
Well, my friends and I have been blamed for the consequences of the Iraq War. This was not what happened was not our view. We lost. What do I mean? We wanted to get in. We wanted to turn this over to Iraqis. And I must tell you, for the previous 12 years, I spent an enormous amount of time with Iraqi opposition leaders, with Kurds, with Arab Sunnis and Arab Shiites. And I think I understood them very well. I was comfortable with them. And I said to myself, the ones, and when you really know what a person, the way you really know what a person wants or how he thinks is you have an argument, you get into an argument where people are passionate, and that's where they say what they really think. And I had done this. I had so many arguments, but these were not arguments of I hate you, you hate me. They were getting to the basis of what was going on over the years. And what my friends and I in the government wanted to do was turn this over to these series of Iraqis and let them sort it out. And we would be there, shall we say, if necessary, to knock heads together. We would not deal with Iraq internally, because if I may say so, and at the risks of sounding a bit tooting my own horn, I think I knew these people, the Iraqis, probably better than, let's say, most of the Americans and Europeans who dealt with the Iraq issue. Most of them were Johnny-come-latelys, and they insisted upon trying to understand Iraq in Western terms, which was impossible. I got, on a scale of 1 to 100, I got maybe a grade 10s, 20s, or 30s out of 100. And I was one of the best. And if I was one of the best, do you see how little we seem to understand? I could give you stories like you would make your hair stand up about what they thought. The problem is in Iraq, we tried to impose a Western government to try to make Iraq a Western country. And that wasn't going to happen because they knew they were no match for the United States. But once we were there, they began to use this phrase again, the third time I'm going to say it, asymmetric warfare. They would hit us here, they would hit us there, and they would wear us down. And behind so much of this were the Iranians who were everywhere. And they were quiet and they were polite and they talked with a lot of our senior officials in Iraq. And they looked you straight in the face, and the Iranians are so good at smiling and being polite and kind and deadly. But we didn't see the deadly part because we know when, again, as I said before, when you look at a Westerner or American in the eye, you're not lying. But they are experts in this. And they wore us down, and we eventually fled. We violated Bernard Lewis's command, shall we say, almost commandment. Go get in, do your work, and get out. The Iraqis should have done this. Would that have been guaranteed success? Nothing is guaranteed. We cannot know the future. But at least we would have had a chance. And our job would have been, we could have done this from the air, we could have done this from abroad. Eventually, under the great President Trump, we took out Qasem Soleimani, who was really the brains, the mastermind of the Iranian operation against America, against our allies, our Arab allies, against Israel. And then they knew we meant business, and they were unbelievably scared when we did it. It's the only way to do it. Go in. You don't ever go in and take over their territory. And Simon, I retired when I was 60. That's 11 and a half years ago. I retired because, frankly, I couldn't take the pressure anymore, and I'm capable of absorbing enormous amounts of pressure. What do I mean by that? Our people simply did not want to know by then. The Obama administration, when I retired, I was in power for already a year. I realized there's nothing I could do. And they didn't want to know. They wanted to bow down to the Iranians and come to any type of agreement. And in the Middle East, there's no such, negotiations can only occur in the Middle East after victory. This is how they understand it. And negotiations means the victor dictates the terms of how everybody's going to live together to the vanquished, to the defeated ones. The goal of the defeated one is to lick your wounds and wait. In the Middle East, they know how to wait. They can wait for forever because the time will come and we will get back. We'll get back at you. And the Iranians went from being in a terrible shape with all these sanctions against them, and we lifted everything. And all of a sudden, and Obama's delivering to them $150 billion on, they called plats, cash. And all it did was strengthen Iran, instilled fear in our Arab allies, certainly didn't instill fear in Israel because Israel is certainly not going to be giving up. It doesn't let anybody make decisions for it, thank God. Once the Americans, the strongest power, the big gorilla in the street, once we're helping the other side, our Arab allies in the Gulf said we have no choice, but we have to come to an accommodation with the Iranians. We made it happen, and today our quote negotiators, and from what I can see, and I read what the Iranians are saying mostly on this because it's much more interesting. The Americans, I think, are lying to us publicly through their teeth of what's going on in Vienna, but we're kowtowing over and over again. And the more we give in, which is what we are doing, the more the Iranians demand for us. In the Middle East, When some says, come, let us reason together, and we know where that phrase comes from. When someone says that, if you say that, you're weak. Now's my time to push you, to up the ante. And that's what they did in the JCPOA, the Iranian in 2015 agreement. And that's what they're pushing America to do today. And the same people who are doing the negotiating today with the Iranians, these are the ones who negotiated the agreement, the failed agreement in 2015 with Iran. And if you look at the names, many of them, of these senior people, negotiated the agreement with North Korea, where we were trying to prevent them to acquire nuclear weapons. We saw how that worked. You must use the other culture to get what you want done. President Trump was much better at this than any other president in recent history. The administration today.
We're down to less than 10 minutes of the program. But I have to ask you really the big question regarding the Obama administration and now President Biden and his administrations towards the Middle East. They've completely dismantled President Trump's Middle Eastern foreign policy, which was to essentially to curtail the Iranian dominance of the region, to empower America's former allies such as Israel, the Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia, and actually contain the Islamic extremism and terrorism in the region, which he did extremely well by recognizing they have to recognize Israel and they have to recognize Jerusalem. But with Obama, he produced a paper called The Middle East Without Israel. And so therefore, why would a Democrat want to empower the Iranian regime and say that this is the most powerful nation in the region, and we're going to base our entire foreign policy into supporting this regime? It makes no sense.
I think it may make sense, and you, I think, will agree with me. We know very little, truthfully, about Obama's background. Obama wrote a book, Dreams from My Father. It's an interesting book. Obama didn't know his father. His father was a Kenyan Muslim who was around on and off till he was 2 years old, and then Obama met him once again when he was 10. That means that he had no idea who his father was. Now, in Islam, if your father is a Muslim, you're a Muslim. You have no say in this. I'm not saying that Obama was or was not a Muslim, but that's how the Muslim world saw him, because his father was Muslim. He, by definition, had to be a Muslim. You don't choose your identity. Your identity is given to you in the Middle East. Now, what's in this book, Dreams from My Father? Very choice of interesting word, from my father. He makes it clear. It's a viciously anti-American book. It supports, the heroes of the book are Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. Anybody that America was for, the Obama's father, as if to say, was for. Well, if Obama didn't know his father, how do you know what his father's dreams were? I suspect that he applied these, he said that they were his father's dreams, but I suspect that they were his. Obama's no friend of the United States. He's no friend of the West. And I think he did his damnedest to help bring it down. Now, I want to just I think that's what was behind the JCPOA. I think that they were, from my opinion, they certainly were anti-Christian. They belittled Christianity. They belittled Judaism. They belittled the Western tradition, again, which was so deeply important to those who established the United States, who under Obama, and we're getting this today by the so-called progressives, they were a bunch of old white men. Well, they were a bunch of brilliant old white men who had wonderful women behind them, who supported the idea of they loved Western Christian, Judeo-Christian values. They loved the values of Mount Sinai. They loved the Creator, the Declaration of Independence, is all, the word creator is listed all the time. The creator is God. The people who are running things today, I would call it Obama on steroids. It's the same people. I don't know who's running the American government today. When I see President Biden, I'm ashamed he's the president of my country. I'm ashamed because there's something not 100% there today. And I'm no fan of the New York Times, but if a friend of mine called me and told me there was an article that the New York Times said that they're setting up Kamala Harris for failure. I don't know who's behind all of this, but it isn't the people that we think are running things. Totalitarian regimes, and I think we are in the process of having one here in the United States, and this scares me like you cannot imagine. They always put out people in front who, as puppets. And that's, to me, what Obama, who's really not capable of making decisions. You don't need to be a genius or to understand that something is radically wrong with his brain. And Kamala Harris, she's not able to make these decisions. I don't know who is, but it's very dangerous for our future. And these are the people. And I would just maybe end with this. America is the big 250-pound gorilla on the block. If America is going to the other side, when then Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel came to Congress in defiance of President Obama and spoke against the Iran deal, which was about to happen, I think it was 2015, maybe 14, whatever it was, the people in the Gulf, especially the UAE and Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia behind the scene and a few other Arabs said, hey, wait a minute, if America is going to go nuts on us and abandon us, if we can't have the 250-pound gorilla, then maybe the Israelis are the 10-pound, 10-ton gorilla or something like that, that we can work with. The reason the people in the Gulf are working with Israel is not out of any love of Israel. They have common interests. First of all, Iran. They have technologically, Israel is a powerhouse like it's unbelievable, this tiny little land. And the Gulfies have money and they're working together on all sorts of projects, both in the Gulf and in Israel. And it's mutual interests. And I must say one other thing, the UAE, the Emirates foreign minister criticized the West in a conference, and I can send you the video if you are interested.
Of course.
What he said, he's at a conference. The conference is in Arabic and with translation, but there is one thing, it's only a 45-second clip. And it says, there's a British woman who's asking a question. And the foreign minister goes into English, and his English is certainly better than mine. It's unbelievable. And I'm a native speaker of English. And he says, you think you know the Middle East, that you know Islam better than we do. And you are wrong. And he did it much more subtly, like you, who are a Brit, can do than I can, Simon. And you are wrong, and you are endangering yourselves, and you're endangering us. These are people who have a history of knowing how to deal with awful forces, the people in the Gulf. And they know how to deal with Iran. And Israel is their natural ally. And if America was, shall we say, since it's abandoning them, you would assume, the Americans thought in our government here that if we abandon the Abraham Accords and go for this Palestinian settlement, and no one gives a damn about the Palestinians in the Middle East, especially the leadership, Mahmoud Abbas, who's head of the Palestinian Authority, or Hamas. Palestinians are nothing more than cannon fodder for the Palestinians, for what we call the Palestinian leaders. And these people in the Gulf say, if anything, they're strengthening the Abraham Accords by since the Biden administration has taken over. Much, I think, to the chagrin of the American administration, who does lip say, of course we want the Abraham Accords, of course. And the people, I must tell you, in the UAE hate the Palestinians because they tried to overthrow so many of the Gulf regimes. They don't want the Palestinians there. Israel is their natural ally, and America, God willing, that we will have the opportunity to have people who again believe in the founding fathers of the United States, who will eventually, God willing, be able to wrest this country from the control of the totalitarians that I think are running it right now, and we can
Dr.
get
Harold
back to
Road,
some sanity.
I just want to thank you so much for being my special guest on today's Middle East Report. I'm going to have to interview you again because this has been an absolutely it's been a fascinating and inspirational interview. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Simon.
And I just want to thank you for watching this very special Zoom edition of the Middle East Report with Dr. Harold Road. I think we've learned so much about the Middle East from his experience working in the Pentagon, his understanding of Islam and the region. And I think his message is one that the West needs to wake up to the very dangerous threat that we're facing from Islamic extremism in the West, but also the danger of our Western democracies imploding inside. So we need to continue to pray for Israel. We need to pray for the West that we would remain strong. I want to thank you for watching this home edition of the Middle East Report.